Well, hello everyone. Good to see you today. We are reading today from Matthew chapter 5. Matthew chapter 5. This is the reading for Friday, January the 22nd. And some of you may have already finished the reading for today. And if you have, that's great. My apologies for not getting the video published a little bit sooner. That was my expectation, but life happens and it didn't make it. So we're going to do it now, and hopefully you can either read along with me again as we go through Matthew chapter 5, or you can at least benefit from some of the thoughts that I share as we think about some of the verses in this chapter. Now, I'm not going to analyze this entire chapter. If I did, this video would be forever long because there's so much here. This, of course, as you know, is the beginning of the Sermon on the Mount. This most incredible sermon that perhaps has ever been preached. I suspect that I can say that with certainty. But more incredible than the sermon is the speaker. Jesus here teaches on amazing principles and things that are so helpful and so good for us to learn. But before we dive into Matthew chapter 5 and the beginnings of the sermon, I want to look with you at Matthew chapter 4, and I want to show you something here that will help us as we think about this sermon and as we introduce this sermon. Matthew chapter 4 and verse 23 says, Jesus was going throughout all Galilee, teaching in their synagogues and proclaiming the gospel of the kingdom. Proclaiming the gospel of the kingdom. I want to suggest to you that that's what the Sermon on the Mount is. It is a kingdom sermon. It is a sermon that is designed to tell people that if you want to be a follower of Christ, if you want to be in His kingdom, this is what is expected of you. And so as Jesus sees this large crowd that has gathered around Him, that's mentioned in verse 25, and in chapter 5 and verse 1, Jesus begins to preach this great sermon. Chapter 5 and verse 1 says, When Jesus saw the crowds, He went up on the mountain, and after He sat down, His disciples came to Him. He opened His mouth and began to teach them, saying, Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted. Blessed are the gentle, for they shall inherit the earth. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they shall be satisfied. Blessed are the merciful, for they shall receive mercy. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called sons of God. Blessed are those who have been persecuted for the sake of righteousness, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are you when people insult you, and persecute you, and falsely say all kinds of evil against you because of me. Rejoice and be glad, for your reward in heaven is great. For in the same way they persecuted the prophets who were before you. You are the salt of the earth. But if the salt has become tasteless, how can it be made salty again? It is no longer good for anything except to be thrown out and trampled underfoot by men. You are the light of the world. A city set on a hill cannot be hidden, nor does anyone light a lamp and put it under a basket, but on a lampstand, and it gives light to all who are in the house. Let your light shine before men in such a way that they may see your good works and glorify your Father who is in heaven. Now, this is kind of the introductory section to the Sermon on the Mount. And there's a lot of things that we could comment on here. The first 12 verses are oftentimes referred to as the Beatitudes, and there's some rich teaching there. And then verses 13 through 16 talks about being salt and light, and those are familiar to us. But for our study today, I would really like to concentrate on verses 17 through 20. Because beginning at verse 17, you really have the thrust of where Jesus is going for at least chapter 5, the rest of chapter 5, but I think even farther into chapter 6 and 7 as well. At this point, we've already seen in our earlier readings, Jesus has had some conflicts with the Pharisees and the Jewish establishment. They don't like him. They feel like he is trying to upend everything, that he is trying to, that he is denigrating the law of Moses, and that he is putting down the Pharisees, who are the teachers of the law of Moses. And so there are some misunderstandings about what Jesus is trying to accomplish. And Jesus directly deals with that in chapter 5 and verse 17, when he says, "Do not think that I came to abolish the law or the prophets." You see, that's what many of the Pharisees were thinking. This man is speaking ill of the law. He is putting down the law of God. And Jesus is saying, no, that's not at all what I'm doing. I'm not trying to abolish it. I came, as he says in verse 17, to fulfill it. I came to fulfill the law, not throw it out. Now, that does not say, that is not to say that the law would never be done away with. We know from other passages that it would, but that's not what's in view here. Jesus is talking about just dismissing the law as unnecessary or as something that can simply be disregarded, and here he's going to tell us about something better. He says that's not the purpose. I didn't come to destroy it or abolish it. I came to fulfill it. I came to fill it to the full. Now, think about that word, fulfill. When we talk about the word fulfill, typically in a religious or spiritual context, we oftentimes talk about the fulfillment of prophecy. So there may be a prophecy in the Old Testament. Maybe it's messianic, maybe it's not. But does that prophecy have a fulfillment? Did it come true? Did it come to pass? And that's partly the idea, or I think that is the idea that Jesus is trying to convey here. The law, instead of being something that Jesus is trying to disregard and dismiss, he says, no, I came to fulfill it. There were prophecies in the Old Testament, messianic prophecies, and Jesus says those are about me. There were types and shadows, foreshadowings of events that would come in Jesus' time. And he came to fulfill those. He came to be the one who brought those things to pass. The New Testament says that the law pointed us to Christ. That's Galatians chapter 3. That there were things in the law of Moses that were looking forward. And the Bible says that Jesus is the fulfillment of those things. And so that's what Jesus is talking about here. I'm not here to dismiss the law. I'm not here to destroy it. I'm here to fulfill it, to complete it. And I am here to be the substance to all of those shadows. I am here to be the one who fulfills all of those prophecies that were given before. So he corrects this misunderstanding about who he is and what he's trying to do. Do not think that I came to destroy, but I came to fulfill. And he says in verse 18, "For truly I say to you, until heaven and earth pass away, not the smallest letter or stroke shall pass from the law until all is accomplished." Again, that's the same idea. Fulfilled, accomplished, until it is completed. So Jesus says every single portion of the law that was foreshadowing, looking ahead, prophesying, giving us a dim glimpse, he says, I am come to fulfill it, to give clarity, to give completion to all of those things. So then, in verse 19, "Whoever then annuls one of the least of these commandments and teaches others to do the same shall be called least in the kingdom of heaven. But whoever keeps and teaches them, he shall be called great in the kingdom of heaven." And so those verses are really preparatory. They're setting the stage for what he is about to say in verse 20. "For I say to you," Notice the authority with which he speaks. I say to you that unless your righteousness surpasses that of the scribes and Pharisees, you will not enter the kingdom of heaven. Now, this verse really serves as the thesis statement for where he's going, at least through chapter 5. He sets forth this contrast. You have the righteousness of the scribes and Pharisees, which Jesus says is not enough. Your righteousness must exceed that of the scribes and Pharisees. Now think about how that would have sounded to the people in Jesus' audience. You know, they knew the scribes and the Pharisees as the spiritual elite, the high and mighty of the religious system. They were the keepers of the law, the teachers of the law. They were the ones who were in the synagogues giving instruction, telling everyone how they should live. And you're saying that we have to exceed their righteousness? But you see, Jesus is going to make this plain in the rest of the chapter. But even beyond Matthew 5 and the sermon here, how many times did Jesus rebuke the Pharisees for their hypocrisy? How many times did he rebuke them for saying one thing but doing something else? He called attention to their hypocrisy in Matthew chapter 23 when he pronounced the woes upon them. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, because you do such and such. And he levied a number of complaints against them, criticisms against them that were legitimate and fair because they were guilty. They were hypocrites. That's really what Jesus is getting at here. I know it seems like the Pharisees are the religious elite and so forth, and it seems like that they are extremely righteous, but in reality, their hypocrisy is rampant. And in my kingdom, because remember, he's preaching the gospel of the kingdom. In my kingdom, it will not be this way. You will not enter my kingdom if your righteousness does not exceed theirs, if your righteousness is not genuine, if your righteousness is fake and hypocrisy and a facade of righteousness like theirs is, you will not enter the kingdom of heaven. And so now Jesus sets forth a series of contrasts through the rest of this chapter, where he goes through item after item, and he shoots down all of the Pharisaic perversions in their application of the law. Look at verse 21. You have heard that the ancients were told, you shall not commit murder, and whoever commits murder shall be liable to the court. But I say to you that everyone who is angry with his brother shall be guilty before the court. And whoever says to his brother, you good for nothing, shall be guilty before the Supreme Court. And whoever says, you fool, shall be guilty enough to go into the fiery hell. Now let me just explain what I see happening here. He talks about murder in verse 21. He talks about adultery in verse 27. He mentions divorce in verse 31. He talks about vows that are made in verse 33. He talks about revenge and vengeance in verse 38. All of these things and beyond in this chapter, Jesus is pointing out the Pharisaic traditions which were being taught. He is not saying, this is what the law of Moses says, and this is what I say. That's not what's happening here. Remember verse 20. Your righteousness must exceed the righteousness of the scribes and Pharisees. He says to the people, you have heard that the ancients were told such and such. Who told them? The teachers, the Pharisees, the scribes. This is what you have heard from the Pharisees, from the teachers of the law. Well, the ancients were told such and such. And Jesus says, I am setting the record straight here. I am dismissing of the Pharisaic perversions. I'm dealing with the traditions of the Jewish establishment, and I'm putting that aside, and I am telling you about kingdom righteousness. I say to you that in the kingdom of heaven, it will be this way. That's the contrast. It is not a contrast between what the law of Moses truly said and what Jesus is now saying. That's not the point here. All of this is connected to verse 20. So as you read through chapter 5 today, keep that in mind, that Jesus didn't come to destroy the law of Moses. And that would be what he would be effectively doing if he said, the law of Moses said this, but I say this. He would be doing the very thing he said he was not doing in verse 17. But as verse 20 tells us, he is making plain the difference between the Pharisaic righteousness, which is a righteousness that is shallow and hypocritical, and kingdom righteousness that he is preaching for those who wish to enter into his kingdom. Thanks for reading and thinking about this with me today. I hope this helps you as you make your way through chapter 5.